Welcome to the first instructor video for Humanities 101M, not, of course, counting the introduction to the course. And I just want to remind you about the best way to consume these instructor videos. They are, of course, intended to be really the first thing you do every week to watch the instructor videos. And then and there's usually two or three. I think there's ever more than three. And then as soon as you're done, presuming that you've paid good attention and taken good notes, turn right around and take a short quiz that goes along with it. I also want to remind you that the art that we're studying in this course is a kind of special category. And so I'll be teaching art in and through these instructor videos, and the art material will be fair game for the weekly quizzes. So that's not the first time you've heard that or read that, just a reminder. So these instructor videos are meant to kind of give you an overview of what we're doing in the week, and we could summarize week one with one word, and that is prehistory. Now, that's a strange term. It's really kind of a misnomer, because if we think of history as human history, and then we talk about prehistory, it sounds like we're talking about the era before there were human beings, but that's actually not the case. Prehistory simply means the period of human history when there was no writing, when people did not have a written language. They had a spoken language, not a written one. So really, that's all that prehistory is telling you, that this is the era of human history when writing had not yet been developed. I did think that given how much history we are doing in this course, it might be good to say something right off the bat about the very enterprise of doing history, even what we mean by the term history. When we talk about history, at least in this class, we're not simply talking about the past, like the sum total of everything that has ever happened for all time. We're not talking about that. History, for our purposes, is the human reconstruction of the human past. And not just a reconstruction of the past, but an interpretation of the past, trying to say what the past means and which events in the past were really pivotal and which were perhaps not so much. Now, it is a reconstruction of the past, and in order to produce a reconstruction, you have to have evidence. This is what makes history different from writing fiction. So what counts as evidence, at least for historians of the ancient world? There are two major categories. The first major category is written evidence. And for most historians, this is going to be the most significant evidence that is available. And written evidence is a huge category. It can include everything from grocery lists to epic poems. Okay, so it's a big category. The second category, though, is artifacts. Okay, human material productions. And that's also, a huge category, because again, that can include everything from shirts to the ruins of a temple. And so this is where archaeologists really come in quite handy. So you need evidence But again, the historian does more than just gather the evidence and kind of put it into one big room and say, here you go, we got the past. Uh, Rather, the evidence itself requires interpretation. And this is a very delicate and often very difficult task, um, for a number of reasons. First of all, there's always going to be missing evidence. There's always going to be evidence, written or otherwise, that you wish you had, but which is simply not available or has not been made available yet. But then, even with the evidence that you do have, there are problems. The evidence may be ambiguous, it may be capable of multiple different interpretations. The evidence may be potentially misleading, right? You may discover a diary that someone has written, but perhaps it's not the most honest person in the world. So, do you just take everything at face value? No, you can't. You have to be skeptical as a historian. So, to sum all this up, I would say that history has a scientific element. It also has an artistic element. It's scientific because it deals with evidence, it demands evidence, but it's artistic because it requires interpretation, and interpretation is not chemistry. It's very much a human art that requires imagination, sympathy, empathy, and so on. All right. Well, that's just something to keep in mind. And I think is well worth saying today, because when it comes to reconstructing the prehistorical period, you really have to have a lot of imagination. The evidence, especially since we don't have any written evidence, the evidence is not only lacking, but as we will see when we look at things like cave paintings, there are a number of instances in which we have evidence, and we're quite sure that this evidence dates from this period, but it's none too clear exactly what we're even looking at, and what it tells us about the cultures of that time. So it's certainly going to involve some speculation. And I'll mention again your writing prompt this week for the discussion forum. But I do note in the writing prompt that you need to feel free to speculate, because when we're dealing, especially with prehistory, speculation is just inevitable. Okay, so I've used the term prehistory to describe what we're studying today, but another term we could use to sort of as an umbrella for this whole period is the Stone Age. Okay, so Stone Age, prehistory, we're basically talking about the same thing. Now, dates are very approximate. The dates that West and the world give us are 600,000 BCE to 10,000 BCE. And let me say something, three notes about dates, and those dates in particular. The first is, again, these are very schematic dates. They're very approximate. No one really thinks that on January the 1st, 10,000 BCE, something magical happened, and now we enter into this new period of time. So they're very, very approximate. The second thing to say about the dates is that I'm well aware that people have different opinions about the age of the earth, and certainly everyone is entitled to those opinions. I'm teaching these dates because these dates represent the consensus view of scholars, or at least the majority view of the scholars who are experts in this field. And even if you want to go on and disagree with those experts, it's very important to know what they're saying. Third, if the BCE CE terminology is new to you, it's very simple to explain. BCE is exactly equivalent to BC, and CE is exactly equivalent to AD. So if something happened in 5000 BCE, it happened in 5000 BC. If something happened in 500 CE, that's 500 AD. BCE, before the Common Era. CE, the Common Era. As you might guess, this terminology was meant to be more inclusive because obviously BC, AD, before Christ, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, is very sort of flagrantly Christian language. Um, anyway, I don't care. I don't feel like I have a dog in the fight. I'll probably use both terms. Just be aware that you're not having to learn a new dating system. Okay, so if you're familiar with BC AD, hope you are, then you're going to be just fine. Okay, so as you read West in the World, the main things that you want to walk away from in this week's reading is a good grasp of what is really distinctive about Paleolithic culture, the way human beings lived in the Paleolithic era, and what is really distinctive about Neolithic culture. Now, there's going to be some continuity between them. In fact, I already mentioned one example of that. There's no writing during either of these periods. So that's something that those two periods have in common. But there are some important differences as well. I want to focus more on, since we don't have an art history textbook, I want to focus more in this presentation on art. And as I've already indicated, art is really one of the primary ways in which we can say anything at all about these cultures anyway. So let me share my screen with you, and we'll look at a couple of things together. All right. So we're going to look at 3 works from the Paleolithic period, and then we'll look at 1 Neolithic work of art. The first work is the Venus of Willendorf, or sometimes just called the Woman of Willendorf. She looks rather impressive in this slide, and we're getting a front and a rear view here. But this is actually, and this is important to know, this is a small kind of figurine, something like 3.5 inches tall, and apparently did not ever have any kind of pedestal that you could sort of stand it up on. That's significant because that meant that it was probably something carried around on one's person. In a pocket, or perhaps worn as jewelry, or something like that. Obviously, we have no idea what the people who made it or who used it called it. The Willendorf refers to the small Central European city in which it was discovered. And the Venus is, that comes from the hypothesis that this figurine represents some kind of fertility goddess. So just as for the Romans, Venus was the great goddess of fertility, that perhaps this figure represented a god of that nature. I think that's certainly possible, if not probable. Either way, I think it's quite clear that this figure sort of is a symbol of fertility, and a reminder that for Paleolithic people, fertility, both in terms of human reproduction, but also in terms of plant life, that these were major preoccupations for people at this time. It is, though, very interesting, if we do accept this hypothesis that this is some sort of fertility goddess, this tells us something very interesting about early human beings, Number one, I mean, just think about the fact that thousands of years before human beings were writing things down, they were making art. But it also suggests that really from the earliest ages, human beings were religious, for better or for worse. One other thing I want to say about this piece is it's a really good example of sort of Stone Age art in general, especially Paleolithic, in that Paleolithic is old Stone Age. I believe West in the World makes that clear, but just in case, Paleo, old, lithic from the word stone, old Stone Age. Paleolithic art is really marked by this blending of abstract and representational elements. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the Venus of Willendorf, it doesn't take a great deal of time and imagination to figure out that you are looking at a woman. However, the anatomy of this woman is obviously highly exaggerated and artificial, right? It's very geometrical, and it's very impersonal, right? There's no real face. There's either this sort of very artificial looking hair or some sort of cap. And so I don't think the artist was going for a naturalistic depiction of a woman, right? So you have this sort of basic figural or representational core, pretty clearly a woman, but it's a very artificial, stylized, kind of distorted image of a woman. Stylized for very obvious reasons, right? Stylized in order to emphasize the fertility. Okay, well, I want to turn to another genre of Paleolithic art, and I should hasten to add, you'll see this in West in the World. The Venus of Willendorf is not the only figurine like this we have from the Paleolithic period. In fact, there's one that's featured in the book that's even older than this one. But the other major genre of Paleolithic art is cave art, okay? And there are a couple of caves in particular, mainly in France and in Spain, that are really famous for having this extensive cave art. Most of it probably produced between 15,000 and 10,000 BCE, so towards the tail end of the Paleolithic era. Again, we have no idea who the artists themselves were, although there are various indications that many, if not most of the artists may have been women. And I won't get into how we know that or why we speculate about that, but it's something we're thinking about. All right, so let's just start with this image here, the Hall of Running Bulls. This is characteristic of Paleolithic cave art in that it is minimally interested in the human figure. There are some human figures that you can find in cave paintings, but they tend to be, they don't show up that often, and they tend to be very kind of crude, almost like stick figures, very abstract. Much more interest in animals and all sorts of different animals. And the animals are portrayed, much more sort of naturalistically than the human figures tend to be. So just to give you an example of that naturalism, here's another panel from a different cave. This is Chauvet. This is called the lion panel for obvious reasons. And you might expect that, given that this is some of the earliest painting in the history of the human species, you might expect it to be very crude and sort of unsophisticated. But as a matter of fact, you can see that the artist or artists here have used various mechanisms to create a sense of depth or recessive space. So you have the fact that there are these overlapping forms, the lines sort of overlap so that you have this sort of illusion that some of them are closer to you, the viewer, than others. And the other obvious thing going on here is the shading that you can see, especially on the faces of some of those lines. So again, there are some really naturalistic, realistic, representational elements here. But I should add that there you often find certain kind of abstract symbols, um, lines, dots, things that don't necessarily seem to resemble something in the real world. So again, it's as with the Venus of Willendorf, there's a blend of the abstract and the representational. Now, the big question for historians and archaeologists is what exactly, why were these images made? This was not interior decorating, okay? These paintings were produced deep in the recesses of these caves where people certainly did not live, and it was, I mean, it's amazing that people got so far in these caves and were able to paint um, in these very, very dark places. So what were people up to? Well, I'll just remind you of, two things. One is, of course, we can never really know for sure, um, and we can only speculate. But the other thing is that there doesn't necessarily have to be one reason or one purpose. It could be more than one. It could simply have been a leisure time activity. So you've done your hunting or gathering for the day, and you want to express yourself. That's plausible. Um, it could be a form of storytelling, either on a very literal level, telling the story of a hunt, or it could be a kind of symbolic story. Certain animals represent certain families or clans or whatever. Again, as with the Venus of Willendorf, there's been a lot of speculation about whether there might have been a kind of religious dimension here, a kind of magical dimension. Perhaps these deep recesses of the caves were places where certain religious rituals took place. Perhaps even the act of painting itself was seen as a kind of magical means of ensuring a good hunt or something like that. So lots of different possibilities. That's just really sort of scratching the surface. But again, you can see why I would say that historians really do need to have imagination. If because you don't go into these caves and find little captions that people left, right? Because there was no writing yet. Okay, well, let's go ahead and move into the Neolithic age, defined in West in the world as 10,000 to 3,000 BCE. And the Neolithic period is not a one-size-fits-all historical period that happens at the same time everywhere, okay? The Neolithic period is the result of what scholars call the Neolithic Revolution. And it basically boils down to one thing, and that is the invention of agriculture. Okay, so if you're looking for the essential differentiating point between Paleolithic and Neolithic, that's it. Paleolithic culture is not agricultural. Neolithic culture is, or at least is beginning to be. And that's going to have all kinds of implications. That's going to have all kinds of consequences. Of course, it's not hard to think about some of the positive consequences, right? I mean, until people have agriculture, they can't really settle down. And until people are able to settle down, you can't really have cities. And until you have cities, you're not going to have other sorts of cultural activities. But as your textbook will point out, there were a number of negative repercussions of this Neolithic revolution. So that's something worth considering as well. Something that I hope this course will help disabuse you of is this idea that in history, things are always getting better in every way all the time. I think what's closer to the truth of the matter is that in some ways, things are always getting better, but in other ways, things are always getting worse. Okay, so let's turn to Neolithic art. And we're just going to look at one example. This is one known to you all, not even just Spinal Tap fans. I think everybody knows about Stonehenge. Now, Stonehenge certainly is special in some ways, but I want to point out that it's not totally unique. This is an example of a megalith. A megalith is a large stone structure that is sort of put together, assembled without the use of mortar. Okay, so that's what a megalith is. Megaliths are basically kind of late Neolithic phenomena. And Stonehenge is simply the most famous example. A henge, by the way, is simply a non-domestic structure that has some kind of ritual significance. Okay, so there's actually lots of henges in Britain. This is just the one that has really captured our imagination. Stonehenge, I mean, one of the reasons why it's so famous is just because of how complex it is, how long it took for it to take the shape that it's in today. There was probably a period of about 1,500 years during which Stonehenge, as we know it, took shape. And of course, some of you are aware that some of the stones come from Wales, which was a long way away. So there's lots of mysteries about how a society, a Neolithic society, was able to create something like this. And there are mysteries about its purpose. You know, what was it for? I mean, this took a lot of thought and labor and time. So whatever they were doing, they weren't just building this for fun. So what's that all about? Well, you know, suffice it to say, in this class, we're not going to solve all these mysteries. But again, I think there is widespread consensus among scholars and archaeologists that this structure had some kind of religious significance. Astronomy in the ancient world was not really something separate from religion. And one thing we know about Stonehenge is that the stones were built in such a way as to align with sunrise on the midsummer solstice, so the longest day of the year, and to align with sunset in the winter solstice. And so probably some kind of religious significance there. Some have speculated about moon worship. Is quite hard to say. But again, it is striking that a society that we know so little about, we can be quite confident that they did have religious beliefs and practices. And of course, the other thing that is a big takeaway from Stonehenge is that this was a highly organized society. It requires organization, a high level of organization, to pull something like this off. So again, a reminder that our Stone Age predecessors were not quite the primitive people that we often think that they might be. Okay, that's all I have in this video. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.